As someone who was in diplomacy a long time, there's things you say publicly, and then there is the more silent and more effective diplomacy that takes place behind the scenes. That's where you unlock issues. By the time I left office, Iran was nearer 60%. We saw for the first time an American administration take a stance. They went in and launched an offensive operation on Iran. But how do you see a progress towards seeing the rights of those citizens protected? By bombing them in a sort of carpet bang way is not, you carpet bomb the whole country. You're not going to suddenly get people sort of welcoming in, others. But hold on a moment. You don't make peace with your friends. You make peace with your foes and enemies. And you need someone to be talking to the other side. And why I say that with Qatar, we identified them as that bridge. So they were able to talk to the Hamas leadership on this important issue of hostage release. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years. And as I've said before as well, we ended up replacing the Taliban with the Taliban. All the investments we made for 20 years, the challenges, the country still stands. We have to stop putting the lens, a Western lens, where we are now, 2026, well, I'm going back a few years, 2023, 24, a Western lens of human rights when we're having a human rights conversation with one of our Gulf partners. You have to recognize that our own journey on human rights, for example, was pretty checkered. 110, 20 years ago, women didn't have the right to vote in the United Kingdom. Some of the stuff that was sent through to me would shock any person. I had death threats, occasions where people turned up at my home. I could have walked from the Foreign Office to Parliament. Inevitably, you're a human being. You think about yourself.
Lord Ahmed, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
About the Middle East and Iran, what are we getting wrong about the Middle East?
Well, the thing is, it's such a vast subject, but one thing is very clear. What happens in the Middle East doesn't stay in the Middle East. Now, someone may say I'm coining a phrase, but from an economic perspective, from a political perspective, and indeed, even from a tourism perspective, we've seen that the war in the Middle East, the ongoing conflicts, but particularly the war since February between the United States and Israel's attack on Iran and subsequent attacks by Iran on sort of perceived allies of the US. And certainly there's a number of allies of the US in the Gulf, such as Bahrain, Kuwait in particular, have taken the brunt of the attacks, reflects that these things aren't contained. And from an economic perspective, we've seen, because here we're talking about a major oil producing region, that the impact's been it's impacting all of us, not just in terms of trading routes, but particularly countries across Asia who rely on Iranian oil, for example. It's had a major impact. So in short, you ask a question, what's going wrong? I think it's just setting some context that what happens in the Middle East doesn't stay there. I think the other thing, just to put a kind of political context, there was successive American governments who were put under a lot of pressure by Israel in particular about the situation in Iran, Iran's continuing nuclear enrichment. I served as a Minister of State at the Foreign Office for over 7 years. And during that time, I had extensive responsibilities for the Middle East and North Africa, but also in terms of our relations with countries such as Pakistan and Iran. The United Kingdom, in a way, acted as a conduit for the US. We retained an embassy there. We had a very active and dynamic ambassador and team on the ground. And we had similar concerns to the US. We had concerns about the continuing enrichment of uranium by Iran. And if I take all our sort of years back to the time of the first, what was called the JCPOA, which was basically an agreement to limit nuclear enrichment in terms of uranium for Iran, that was something that saw the US, European nations, including the United Kingdom. At that time, Philip Hammond was the Foreign Secretary. We had people like Cathy Ashton, Baroness Ashton, who is a great colleague of mine in the House of Lords. She was quite key in terms of negotiations on the provisions of the JCPOA agreement. And that stood the initial test that it did. However, during President Trump's first administration, the United States decided to pull back from it. And I think that sent the wrong signal to Iran in terms of the unity of purpose of nations who wanted to prevent the continuing enrichment of uranium. And subsequently, there were various elements within that particular agreement. You may have heard the phrase snapback sanctions. Well, that was contained within the resolution that was passed at the United Nations Security Council linked to the JCPOA. That meant that if we saw Iran going over certain thresholds, then sanctions would apply. Now, your viewers, some of them may well know it, but we were talking sort of 3.74%, something in that region, of the level of uranium enrichment according to the provisions before sanctions would apply. Well, by the time I left office, Iran was nearer 60%. So, of course, the alarm bells were going off not just in Washington, but elsewhere and in Gulf capitals as well, of what was the end objective in terms of enrichment of uranium. Now, Iran's case presented was it was going to be used for peaceful means. However, what was quite obvious, there was also a program developing, and I alluded earlier to the role of Israel. I think what we saw, coming back to your first question about what went wrong, that we saw for the first time an American administration take a stance in February where, notwithstanding the different views across Europe, including in the United Kingdom, they went in and launched an offensive operation on Iran. And I think we're seeing the challenges of this. I mean, President Trump came in with that he didn't, and I think it was the right objective to begin or pull back from ongoing wars. I think everyone's been fatigued by that over many, many decades. Yet again, what we've seen here is a conflict has begun. And where we've got to now is that both sides, I'm talking of Iran and the US, want an off-ramp. They want to see a conclusion to this. But what we have now in the situation in the Gulf, particularly with the trading issues around the Strait of Hormuz, is perhaps a situation which was not what was perceived, certainly by the United States, but has become leverage for the Iranians in terms of getting a survival of their regime, notwithstanding the change of the spiritual leader, but also a new kind of norm, which is more uncomfortable than what was there before.
So how do you see this unfolding in the Middle East?
Well, I think first and foremost, one's got to sort of recognize that the US is central to this, of course. But equally, I think what we've seen is a shift, and that's perhaps where I look at my own time in office as a minister. You have to be in the mix. You have to be there. You have to be relevant. And the United Kingdom always had a key role. We did the typical British thing. We were often there, but we didn't do it by fanfare. Our diplomacy is very different and has been historically, yet very effective. It was all about relationships, keeping relationships alive. However, if we fast forward to where we are today, I do think we've been in the sort of slow lane on this. And that gap has been filled. And that gap has been filled by countries such as Pakistan. We've seen their prime minister, but also their chief of army staff, Asim Munir, taking much more leading role. We've seen the Qataris and tribute to them for the role they're playing. Egyptians have also played a role in this as well. And you've got some key, not direct negotiators involved, such as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And of course, we can't forget the important bridging role that Oman has always played during our time in office. During my time as minister, Oman was a great friend to the United Kingdom, but was often a bridge in terms of getting diplomatic messages across to Iran. So we've seen that sort of gap being filled not by the United Kingdom or European nations, but the bridge across to the US is being played by other countries further afield, including Pakistan. And because they have the faith of the President of the United States, I think that's acted very powerfully in bridging the gap and having those conversations. If we go back to the Islamabad Accords that were signed, it was providing for 60 days of negotiations. They became fragile and then real challenge to its sustainability. But more recently, in recent weeks, indeed in recent days, we've seen again something that I mentioned in my earlier sort of answer, that both the United States and Iran want to see an end to this conflict. It's in no one's interest. It's no one's interest in terms of security. It's in no one's interest in terms of the economics, not just of the region, but of the world. But there needs to be a suitable off-ramp for both the United States in terms of key questions on the Strait of Hormuz and its operational ability. And I do want to come on to that because I think there is a compromise to be found. But equally, the nuclear question, how will that be sustained if indeed Iran wants to pursue nuclear ambitions in terms of peaceful means, in terms of energy? How will that be monitored? What would be the role of perhaps other countries in the region to help that happen, who are trusted both by the United States and by Iran? I think those things need to be resolved. And then coming back to the Strait of Hormuz, how will they operate? We're talking of a very thin sort of piece of maritime navigation. There's the international laws, something called the UN Convention on the Law of Seas. You may have again seen the name banded around UNCLOS. Well, within UNCLOS arrangements, there's certain navigation points across the world which are essential for trading, for shipping. And again, the Strait of Hormuz is covered by that. However, equally, there are territorial sovereign waters for both Oman and for Iran. And because this is a very narrow waterway, I think there will be some initial agreements reached which will allow the navigation of those countries who are more favorably perhaps disposed to Iran, who have strong trading links with Iran, such as China being, through Iranian sanction, allowing to operate their vessels through the Iranian side. We've already seen the Omani side, which has a lot of support from the United States, also operating. So I think there will be a kind of easing of the pathway, which will allow, first and foremost, the Strait of Hormuz issue to be resolved. It won't go back to what it was pre the 28th of February when this conflict first began.
Why not?
Because I think now it's used as greater leverage. I think the Iranians has been well documented. Many commentators have said it really came up in the sense the key question was always about Iranian enrichment in terms of uranium. But now it's about the Strait of Hormuz. If you pick up the headlines when the conflict started to where we are today, it was all about the nuclear ambitions of Iran. I do not think that's the sort of primary dominant factor, although a key one nevertheless. I think the dominant factor is let's get the straits open, operational, because these are having major impacts, not just to the economies, as I said, of the region, but to the wider world. If you look to the region, you've got Bahrain, a country I know extremely well, and it's been extremely challenged by this because the American Fifth Fleet operates out of Bahrain. There's a British naval base there. In Qatar, there's a air base there. In Kuwait, there's an air base there. And these were, of course, interests which were bilaterally and security arrangements. And I think from a US perspective, those have been sort of fulfilled in the sense of they now stand up. The Americans have tried to extend support to those key Gulf partners. There's a separate question, I suppose, for the United Kingdom. There's something called the CCPA, which is a kind of strategic partnership between the United Kingdom, the US, and Bahrain. But there's also a security element of that. And I think the current government will need to see, as this conflict evolves, what role does it want to play in this particular role? Because these are standing agreements that we have with Gulf countries in the regions. Our own Air Force has operations within other Gulf partner countries. We have standing agreements in terms of trade and strong bilateral relations with all the Gulf states. And I think there is a question for the UK to determine that, as one hopes, God willing, that we see peace being restored to the region, there will be a new norm, coming back to your question, which will not reflect what was there before. Maybe in time we'll have moved back to something resembling what was there before February, but I don't think it's going to be immediate. I think there's going to be a kind of almost three-way compromise. There's a bit in the center which are defined, I think, as about 3 kilometers wide in terms of international waters, but the rest of it are either Iranian territorial waters when it comes to the Strait of Hormuz, or indeed Omani's territorial waters. And I think there will be agreements and arrangements ranged. The other thing I think that viewers perhaps will not be aware of is how vessels are flagged. Sometimes you'll have a vessel belonging to one country flagged under another country and manned by a third country. So I think there are going to be various sort of scenarios that will play out. But I come back to what I said originally. I think there's going to be a big role for some of our key partners in the Gulf. All credit, as I said, to countries such as Qatar, who not just on this particular question of Iran, but I know from my experience as a minister, played a quite phenomenal role when it came to the situation of hostage release in Gaza to get some kind of movement and progress forward. And equally, these countries have balanced their own interests their regional interest and cooperation across the Arab League, the GCC, but also recognizing that there's an important role and relationship to be sustained, indeed strengthened, with the United States. And we've seen President Trump talk very positively of key countries, including the Pakistanis, the Qataris, and a number of other partners, including the Saudis. And I think those countries in the region also recognize that there's new security arrangements that need to be looked at. And that's why I'm saying the Europeans, including the United Kingdom, were in the kind of outer lane, or the slower lane, as I put it earlier. Why? Because take, for example, recently we've seen an agreement between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Pakistan and Turkey. Now, this is a security agreement. It's based on the UN Charter, Article 51, which allows a response on aggression on a given country. But it also incorporates the notion that we hear often within NATO of Article, the NATO article, which basically allows that if there's an attack on one country, it's like an attack on the other. Well, that's what this new agreement resembles. The Mecca agreement, as it's called, Mecca in Arabic, allows these three countries to have that kind of basis. And it's interesting how countries within the Gulf and further afield, Turkey on one side, Pakistan on the others, are now coming to some of these agreements, which will allow and provide the kind of security cover which they need. Some people perceive it as anti-Iran. I don't perceive it just in that context, but I think it's sending a signal to countries such as Iran that there is a more unity of purpose about countries within the region and further afield, which doesn't necessarily involve, and in this case it doesn't, the Europeans or indeed the Americans, but all three countries, be it Qatar, be it Saudi Arabia in this case. I talked of Qatar earlier, but in terms of the agreement, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan and Turkey, there's also an important component. They enjoy good, strong relations with the United States. And irrespective of who the incumbent is and the president is in the White House, I think that relationship remains relevant, not just in terms of the region, but in terms of global progress and prosperity as well.
In your view, what are we getting wrong about Iran?
Well, I think Iran is a very complex country. From the time of 1979 with Ayatollah Khomeini coming in, there was as is termed, an Islamic revolution. Now, I'm a Muslim myself. I don't perceive, and the Islam I grew up with, there was never one which was coercion. There is an Arabic phrase from the Holy Quran, which is La ikrah fi din, where it means there's no compulsion in religion. That basically, it means if you have to compel people to accept something, it's not the way of faith. That's true of Islam. It's true of every other faith as well, that you have to win people's hearts. Now, those are the essence of the teachings of the faith, which certainly were not within this Islamic revolution of suppression, particularly on the rights of minorities. We saw suppression on the rights of women. But Iran itself and its people are very enriched, very well educated. The culture is very rich as well. And I think there has to be a recognition that from a Western perspective, when I was Middle East minister, I always used to take a step back on issues of human rights. I was the UK human rights minister, that we have to stop putting the lens, a Western lens, where we are now, 2026, so I'm going back a few years, 2023, 24, a Western lens of human rights when we're having a human rights conversation with one of our Gulf partners. You have to recognize that our own journey on human rights, for example, was pretty checkered. 110, 20 years ago, women don't have the right to vote in the United Kingdom. Anyone who's seen that film on the suffragettes will see and recognize the kind of suppression women had to endure just to get a right to vote. So let countries who are progressing embark on that journey, see what there is a common platform and build on that, which takes me on to Iran. There are ways and means of trying to build those particular relations. Iran's been not just challenged, it is seriously economically, educationally, infrastructure-wise, politically, increasingly feeling isolated. There was this idea of somehow, when Ayatollah Khamenei, the previous leader of Iran, was also a spiritual leader to some parts of the Shia Muslim community, that his death would herald in a new kind of revolution on the ground and the people's revolution, for want of a better term. That did not happen. Ayatollah Khamenei Jr., Mujtaba Khamenei, who now hasn't been seen but is certainly active. There are some commentators who say he's less influential than his father. I would allude to the fact, yes, his father kept together. It was not a regime or a government that we were favorably disposed to. We had our own challenges, from the Nazneen Ratcliffe situation to other people who were detained in Iran. There were situations, as I said, on the JCPOA, non-adherence, enrichment of uranium. But nevertheless, there was a kind of bridge and a conversation. And Ayatollah Khamenei did have some, in what no doubt no one knew better than him, was keeping different component parts of the Iranian governance structure, including this sort of Revolutionary Guard, the IRGC, who were always the extreme element of it. Recently, you've seen moves in parliament, and I support those of actually sort of putting them and prescribing them. Because here's an organization that doesn't undermine the position of Iran with its partners. It is, in my view, undermining the whole institution of Iran as a state and the rights of its own citizens, and subjecting them to duress, and that's putting it nicely. The worst kind of oppression. We've seen challenges. There was the famous case of Mahsa Amini, who was a woman who was wearing a hijab, but some of the policing and the way she was treated sadly and tragically ended in her death. So the suppression on some of the Iranian communities, but also the general population, has been immense. But how do you see a progress towards seeing the rights of those citizens protected? By bombing them in a sort of carpet bang way is not, you carpet bomb a whole country. You're not going to suddenly get people sort of welcoming in, others. And equally, you said about, you come back to that issue, we're not going to win such wars. The Iraq situation, the situation of NATO's withdrawal in Afghanistan, again, show you can even have boots on the ground, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to see an end objective from how we would like to see it from the West. So I think we need to allow countries to evolve in themselves, but also, here's the key, I think, solution to it, that those countries who have a bridging role, and I alluded to them earlier, who have managed to scope out conversations, communications, and have respect of not just the United States and Western democracies and countries wider in the Middle East, but have a respect within Iranian circles. I think that's going to be the solution of how we move forward, firstly on the issue of Straits of Hormuz, and then also preventing, progress of Iran towards acquiring a nuclear weapon, which I think is a consistent view, not just, as is often said, of the United States or European nations, but it's a view shared by many of our Arab friends and colleagues in the Gulf as well, whether it's the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, UAE, or elsewhere. I think they all sustain that. And that's why I think the role of countries such as Turkey on one side, Pakistan on the other, who have great relations with the US, but also have strong relations with Iran, will be crucial in getting some kind of more positive outcome, not just for the immediate in terms of the opening of the Straits, but seeing a more medium long-term opportunity which sees some sense of security being once again achieved in the region.
What does Iran want to achieve?
Well, that's a question for them. I think it's hard to, I think they've been under the cosh. I mean, what's happened to them, you've seen a whole change at the top. I think from the attack and the new, with Ayatollah Mujtaba Khomeini now in charge, the IRGC and the elements of it, I think, have been strengthened because whatever's happening on the ground there, the governance struggle internally, I think is going to prove important in terms of what emerges. I think the issue of seeking to limit, isolate the IRGC is, on balance, the right approach. And we've got to see how this extremist element of the governance structures of Iran can be put to one side. But equally identify, are those people within the existing structures people that we can sit down and negotiate with? And the short answer is yes, there are. The Speaker or the Parliament has proven to be influential. And, as someone who was in diplomacy a long time, there's things you say publicly. And then there is the more silent and more effective diplomacy that takes place behind the scenes. That's where you unlock issues. When I used to go into a negotiation, we would have the United Kingdom's position. But I also knew in the back of my mind what, the counterparts you were sitting down with. But here's the key thing, and I come back to that it's the bridging role that you can identify. Who is our relationship with? Who does the other side have a relationship with? And maybe if we can observe that third party and identify them as that key bridge between the two sides, then I think you see a solution. In terms of what Iran wants out of it, I think, clearly they want the conflict to end. I think the majority of Iranians want this war to end immediately. We've seen the tragedy of, innocent citizens, children being killed, which is a tragic consequence of any war, but we've seen it played out as we do now, as we saw in places such as Gaza, the horrific cost on ordinary civilians who aren't involved in any political way. So they want to see an end to this as well. But I think the government of Iran is playing for its survival. I think the spiritual element, which Ayatollah Mujtaba Khomeini provides, is key to many in Iranian society. But I think there is also, it should be remembered, that he's the spiritual leader to some, but not all Shia Muslims around the world. But there is an influence that they will have. And how can those more progressive and people that you can sit down with, and as I said, not necessarily publicly, but privately talk to, and those discussions are taking place now, how can they be more empowered? How can their hand be more strengthened? Because ultimately, I think what we all want to see is, an Iran emerging from this, which isn't reduced to absolute rubble, but an Iran emerging where its rights of its citizens and communities are fully protected. And that's where, as I said, some of these countries such as Pakistan, Turkey, Qatar will have a key role to play.
Can I ask you, in your experience, what is the art of diplomacy? Like, what are the kind of lessons you learned about sort of human nature and coming to an agreement behind closed doors? How do you do that? What is the art form?
I think it's about relationships, is defining people. I put it to you, you and I are sitting here, we're having a conversation, you get to know each other, you don't identify, it's not just the formality of the interview, it's what's happened before or what happened subsequently. Relationships matter, whether we're talking personally, whether we're talking business, whether we're talking in the political sphere. And I think the art of diplomacy, certainly over my long period of service, was about that. It was not just speaking to someone because I needed something or they needed to talk to me. It was about building relationships. I can honestly say, it's been over 2 years since I left government, but you forge relationships which often turn into friendships. And it's those relationships when you come and hit the buffers, or there's a difficult negotiation or issue, or where you have differing perspectives, is being able to then call upon that relationship, because your counterparty knows you and you've got to know them. And that's how you unlock some of the most testing and challenging situations. That's certainly what I found. And perhaps I can share with you right now, for example, when we were negotiating on the issue of hostage release, we had the appalling events of 7th of October with Hamas, and then the subsequent sort of almost carpet bombing of Gaza. Just parking aside, and there was loads going on. I had to put up with a lot of heat. I was the Middle East minister, but there were things happening behind the scenes which you couldn't talk about publicly at that time because they were sensitive negotiations. We were a bridge. We had strong relations with countries such as Qatar. Qatar, often there were those who put down negative associations. So Qatar hosts the Taliban and they talk to Hamas, etc. But hold on a moment. You don't make peace with your friends. You make peace with your foes and enemies, and you need someone to be talking to the other side. And why I say that with Qatar, we identified them as that bridge. So they were able to talk to the Hamas leadership on this important issue of hostage release. We had strong relations on the ground. We had strong relations with Qatar, and we were able then to work very closely. And I pay tribute to the Emir of Qatar, Sheikh Tamim, but particularly to their Prime Minister, Sheikh Mohammed, and a dear friend of mine, Dr. Mohammed Al-Khalifi, his deputy, who were quite central to some of the negotiations. And without sort of, going into all the details, the United Kingdom played an important role in bridging and bringing together hostage families with some of the key personnel within Qatar to ensure that the empathy that needed to be created within those relationships was felt. And that personal contact, which the United Kingdom also in part played and helped facilitate. I remember speaking to many hostage family, but I never sought to make a issue out of it in terms of, I've met so many people. Yes, I met many, but my whole drive at that time was what's at your core. It's about dealing with human beings who've got loved ones being detained. On the Palestinian side, meeting with some of their families who were being bomb not through choice, but because the Hamas leadership had committed this sort of heinous act of terrorism on Israel. And I think it was balancing those things out, but then taking out whatever the political and humanizing it, that these were about lives. And I think that's what I learned, that when it came to some of these most difficult situations, my relationship, for example, with the hostage families, Qatar's ability to be able to engage with organizations such as Hamas allowed us to bridge a gap, which I think provided a solution. Ultimately, there were many tragic cases of some of those hostages that were taken and not returned alive, but a majority of them were. And I think that's credit due to countries such as Qatar, but it was also down to the relationship countries like ourselves had. The other thing, despite all the challenges, we kept a door of communication, much against public opinion, open with Israel. And I mention that because you, again, need someone talking to the other side. It's not just about the United States. So it wasn't testing. It wasn't because it wasn't challenging or somehow we're immune from what was being unfolded on the people and the ordinary citizens of Gaza. But we needed to ensure that you had a relationship with the other side. And there were people like Benny Gantz, for example, having very, frank conversations, key leaders, the foreign ministers of Israel, Eli Cohen, and was the foreign, ensuring that we could try and bridge the conversation. So at least we were acting as a conduit, despite the public pressure, despite the public opinion, despite the quite personal challenge these things take. I know the kind of, and there's no better word, abuse that I suffered both electronically, email, on social media, and indeed at times just walking around Westminster. Really? Yeah, it was extreme. But there was something inside me which was driving a fact that you're trying to achieve something here, which is bridging, to retain the dialogue that was necessary to be able to bridge that particular gap. And I know there were very many moments, where I was sitting back and thinking, it'd be easier to walk away from this. The pressure was intense and you're creating but I thought, if I walk away from a situation, all those relationships, all the things I'm personally doing, this is not just on me, it's also on my counterparts that we're dealing with, will all be set back. And ultimately, the people that you're trying to help on the Israeli side, on the Palestinian side, there'll be a gap, there'll be something. So those were the kind of motivations. Your own faith keeps you going, your family support keeps you going. But there were extreme challenges on a personal level, but not. And every time I remember what my late father said, he always said, when you're feeling challenged or feeling that life's really going against you, look in front of you, look to your left, to your right, and behind you, and you'll find people who are perhaps more challenged than you are. Well, when you were the Minister of the Middle East, and number 2 in the Foreign Office, making these calls and decisions, well, actually, it wasn't. You didn't need to look far to see what my late father said to me in terms of scenarios, because people in Gaza were suffering. There were occasions where, because of our relationships with key partners, including Israel, we were able to be in the region constantly. It comes back to a point I made earlier. You have to be in the mix because of the relationships we had, but then some of my Israeli counterparts, that through a quite personal leverage, you could get something pushed forward through connecting some of the dots with other key Arab states who also had relationships with Israel to unblock the issues of humanitarian aid. And when it came to the issues of hostages, that the role that we were able to play together with Qatar in being able to facilitate the release of those hostages together with other key partners. Of course, the Americans were playing a key role, but the UK was in the mix. Coming back to where we were on Iran, sadly, I don't think we are right now. And I think...
Why is that?
Well, that's a reflection. Maybe a representative of the current government would say, well, we are. But, when there's a phrase that's sometimes used in foreign, we're doing all we can. Well, you need to delve deeper into it. What are you doing? Who are you talking to? And sustaining relationships. And I think there needs to be an active engagement and relationship with all partners. Sometimes you agree most vehemently and, have very opposed opinions to some of your countries that you're dealing with, the partners you're dealing with. And we had that many a time, particularly when it came to the Gaza conflict, with countries such as Israel, but we maintained a communication dialogue with them, which meant that they realized also that they needed to engage with us and give something as part of that relationship. I don't think that relationship currently is live in that particular way. Yes, of course, there's diplomatic relations, but I think those relations are being severely challenged. And I think we need to look at all of that in the context of the long term, the medium, the immediate, and the long term solutions we need to find in the region. It comes back to the issue, relationships matter, and diplomacy. At all times, I found it was those investment in relations when no one needed anything. You were just developing relations for the sake of relations. I, as a representative of the United Kingdom with counterparts across the world, not just in the Middle East, but, I could talk about friends I have in the Caribbean, across Africa, in Asia. Why? Because sometimes we're different on our opinions, but at least we were having a conversation in the realms of diplomacy, in the realms of respect, and respecting that someone may have a contrarian opinion to yourself, but not stopping that communication. And I think you need effective communication to resolve these issues. And at the moment, I think Britain has taken a back step on the decisions it's taken.
Why is that?
I think partly it's driven by political will. Do you want to be part of something which is complex? The Iranian conflict demonstrably has shown, and you don't need to be in the mix to show that European nations and the UK have played a periphery role in it. They're not part of the mix. The UK will get more involved actively once the conflict is resolved, and I think we have the capacity, along with the likes of France. I respect that agreement that was reached by the former Prime Minister and President Macron on sending in demining vehicles to the Straits of Hormuz, because we have that specialization. But I think and that's something I'm sure our Gulf partners respect on, but I'm sure many of them sit back and think that if we had agreements in place with the UK, were those agreements stand up to scrutiny and test and challenge? And I think that's a question to be answered. But clearly, you have to be active in the region. And you've got to, when it comes to diplomacy, you have to talk to people you disagree with. You have to talk to people who have differing opinions to you. You have to talk to people who may... I don't think we're doing it as effectively as we can be. There's the cordial, as I said, diplomacy. There's the public and the private. I think the public, I had a call with minister here, I think that's happening, and that happens. So we have cordial relations in a public perspective. But where you resolve these issues, where you resolve the challenges, where you really unlock solutions, is through those private engagements, those private relationships you have, which then result in finding a pathway to peace. And ultimately, that's what we're seeking in these conflicts.
I mean, how honest are you with your opposite number? Unless you've got a strong relationship, you get on, you've got a connection. And how much honesty do you guys share with each other?
Well, I think it develops. It's like you make friends with someone, you get to know someone. There's something you got to like about them, I suppose, and you develop a relationship. In your initial stages, probably quite cautious about what you say. I mean, you don't suddenly lay out every single part of your strategy in terms of, even with your closest allies. I'm sure they don't share with me and everything and anything, but that personal thing, because you're like, 1 minute you're talking about this, and then you're able to have a quite personal conversation, have a bit of a light-hearted moment, for example. Sometimes they say, it can break the tension, or I remember watching a film on the Oslo agreements. I think it's called Oslo as a film. I don't know if you've seen it, or I'm sure some of your viewers have, but there's a wonderful moment in that. And of course, this is a film produced on the actual nature and records of what was produced, where there was big disagreement between the Israelis and the Palestinians over issues. And the Norwegians were hosting it, and suddenly the tensions eased because they started eating together. And suddenly they found they may have had different names for some of the foods and dishes, and each one claimed it as their own. But suddenly they found a connection. They found something which was a common ground. Now, it may be something as simple as food, but what did it do? Two things. And I've seen that happen as well. One, there was something else to talk about, which seems, to the average person, well, we're suddenly talking about food and not trying to solve it. But it's building something. It's also easing the tension. If you're in heightened discussions, intense discussions, it's breaking the intensity of what's being discussed. And there were moments, I remember sitting in many meetings during the Gaza war with colleagues in the Middle East and others around, where they were quite, how can I put it, quite animated discussions going on. But now and again, there'd be an insert of a degree of humor or a more lighter comment on something by not just myself, by one of my colleagues, foreign ministers or whatever. And it would just ease the tension of that moment. And you need that. Ultimately, you're not immune from it. When people came to me and said, why aren't you stopping war? Why is the UK doing this position? How can you do that? And as I said, without going into detail, some of the stuff that was sent through to me would shock any person. But
No way.
by the content of it, as what was being suggested.
Forceful and direct.
Well, I had death threats, which, is not, there were on occasions where people turned up at my home,
Really?
Yeah, I could have walked from the Foreign Office to Parliament, which I would do so. It's a stone throw away. So suddenly you're thinking, and I don't want to think about self, but inevitably you're a human being. You think about yourself. But I think in all of this, there are people you find in all sides, no matter how differing an opinion you have. When it comes to diplomacy, you will find someone, if you're willing to move forward in a progressive way, to move forward not just in a kind of sense of officialdom, but trying to bridge a conversation, that someone else will move forward in that particular way. But it comes from investment in relationships. What I don't think happened, I think we were wrong in that. I think the current government as well, you need continuity. If there's one thing in diplomacy you also learn, what we don't need is a change of prime minister, a change of foreign secretary. It wasn't, I served under 5 different prime ministers. But at the same time, I served under 6 different foreign secretaries in 7 years. That's not the British way of doing things. I started off when Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary, and actually David and I joke about this, David Cameron. He was the one who first appointed me as a minister to the House of Lords. That, I ended my time with David as Foreign Secretary. But he had a different caliber. He had a standing. There were things that he could do because of what he'd done before. My benefit I brought to the table, I was there for 7 years. If they had one hopes a go-to person, actually continuity matters. But it's not just being there. It's what you do when you're there in terms of investment and relationships. I never sought media profiles. I never sought to do this because, frankly speaking, it was about getting your head down and trying to get a job. There were sometimes positive things said. There were, yes, sometimes negative things said to me. For example, I remember during the Afghanistan crisis, to sort of broaden it basis, I went and cancelled my holiday abroad because NATO decided to pull out. I didn't agree with that decision. I still to this day retain we could have done another deal, even though the Americans were pulling out with the Turks, with the Turkish sort of contingent, with the Swedes, but we chose not to. I was lower down the sort of food chain. I had to deal with it. But when the crisis arose, it was like day and night. And there were many, and not ashamed to admit it, there were moments, where you'd absolutely think, oh my God, what's happening here? But there's 2 things that pull you through it. One is the support of those that matter around you. And the other thing for me personally, the personal faith, was faith itself. I always say to my own children, have faith in God and faith in self. And actually, a lot of obstacles you can overcome. There were negative things happening, some degree positive, but I was driven by the fact that you were doing something positive when it came to Afghanistan in trying to deal with a situation where a lot of the parameters that had been set were way beyond your own control. That said, coming back to the Middle East, I think there are still always solutions to be found, because I think in humankind we find people who are inclined towards it. It's not just about hitting headlines, this, that and the other. A lot of the work, which again, I dealt with a lot of diplomats across the Foreign Office, the FCDO, excellent people on the ground who had knowledge, and that key point, continuity as well. So if there's sort of one advice I offer even the new government, amongst others, if they want to listen, is try and keep people in place longer so relationships can be built. And it doesn't just apply to diplomacy, where I believe it is essential. It's also more broadly as well, because relationships matter, whether you're dealing in your personal life, your business life, or indeed politics and diplomacy. Relationships matter, and they often are what find the solutions.
Do you feel that the US has a game plan in the Middle East?
I think it's gone in, perhaps not with, it didn't think this conflict would last as long. I think if one was being objective, you've seen the resilience within the Iranian defense. Clearly, they had planned for this, the kind of disparate nature of how the different sites were perhaps created, which would allow for their continuing attacks they are currently doing right now. Undoubtedly, if you put it, side by side, US against Iran, there's no match. But the Iranians have shown themselves to be resilient to that challenge. The other thing is, of course, the pressure. If you look at the Gulf states, if you're Saudi Arabia, if you're Qatar, if you're Bahrain, if you're Oman, if you're the UAE, even further afield, Oman is there, but further afield in places such as Jordan, you're feeling directly the impact of what's happening there, not just in terms of the economic impact, but the physical impact. Every time there is an attack by the US on Iran, the brunt of it's taken by countries like Kuwait, by Bahrain, because of their association and agreements with the US. And quite often the challenge when you're a small country like Bahrain or Kuwait is not coming because the missile is hit. It's coming because the missile's been taken out and there's the debris falling on what is below. And when you're a small state, an island state, or a small state within the region, that carries a heavy cost as well. So economically, from a trading perspective, but also in terms of security. So I think, in terms of the game plan, I think that's something which perhaps was not factored in by the US. And that's the challenge and strain which is now being felt, because you're seeing directly an impact on those countries which are having consequences now economically on the broader issue, whether it's on prices in the US or prices in the broader market. You look at industries such as aviation, where you've had aviation fuel treble. Now, if you're an airline planning a route and suddenly you're hit by increasing cost prices, it's a challenge. And how will they deal with that increased cost prices? They're going to pass it on. I'm making it more simple, but the consumer picks up the end cost. So suddenly you and I are paying more for our holiday, more for our air. So there is now an impact. We're also seeing issues of food security. Qatar, for example, exports fertilizer in a big way. And suddenly now there's regions of the world which aren't seeing that fertilizer being delivered. So not only is the impact felt by Qatar in terms of its own economy, it's being felt by other regions. A sizable economy, the second largest in the case of China, with all the supply chain complexities, etc., that exists, is a major recipient of Iranian oil. And suddenly that's being curbed. So that's what I mean when I come back to, I think, the US, as has been said time and time again, perhaps didn't perceive that this conflict would go on as long as it has. It needs an off-ramp. But I think all the different scenarios which are now being played out are perhaps not fully factored into when this engagement happened. This wasn't going to be a short, sharp war. Indeed, recent history has shown you only need to look across the border in Iraq to see that when these conflicts are begun, the other side in Afghanistan, they don't necessarily have the outcome one perceived. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years. And as I've said before as well, we ended up replacing the Taliban with the Taliban. All the investments we made for 20 years, the challenges the country still stands, in terms of financial, economic, the suppression on individuals, the lack of women's and girls' rights. There's no, again, just putting in a faith context, this isn't an Islamic perspective. This is a draconian administration suppressing its own communities and populations. And I think we needed to learn the lessons of recent history as well, that by putting in or going in forcefully. And in Iraq, let's not forget, in Iraq, there was support from the Gulf states, which wasn't in this particular occasion. The United States didn't consult extensively, including with the UK, as was then subsequently discovered in going in on Iran. I'm sure I can't speak for the current administration, the previous prime minister, but it would have been clear that they would have not wanted this conflict. And as I said, I was there before, where whilst this was talked about, it's been talked about for over 40 years. Indeed, many in Israel, Mr. Netanyahu being prominent amongst them, wanted this to happen. But there was a resistance that this could be contained in some shape or form. And I think that outcome and what we're seeing playing out in the region right now and the wider world economy was not factored in.
Which leader had the right approach?
Well, I don't think anyone had the right approach, because you see that by the cost of human conflict. But ultimately, all wars and conflicts end with agreements, and we're at that now. So I think rather than answer, I don't think any of them had it right, I think is that those countries who are now playing that important role in bringing different sides together need to be commended, first of all, supported, importantly, and one hopes, God willing, that the outcomes can then be fully supported. And then we as the UK, and indeed other countries, say, what role can we play? When you're looking at a diplomatic solution, you put all your cards on the table and you say, right, this is our country, this is our ability, this is what we can do. In this particular instance, with Iran and the situation in the Gulf, the challenges that many of our key Gulf partners have had to endure, what role could we now be playing? I think it's the right call that we have mining vessels which are readily available who can go in and open up some of these straits. Okay, specific, let's do that. But let's put specific timelines on this. And I think ultimately when we're looking at the Middle East, we shouldn't lose sight. It's in the news again, the whole issue of Gaza and the West Bank, etc. I still believe that ultimately until you secure the rights of all communities, and in this context, there were many hostage families I spoke to in Israel who were suffering, who were quite often quite liberally minded towards the Palestinians and the Palestinian cause, and they suffered this. But even despite that, said to me quite often privately that they realized that the security of Israel, the prosperity and progress of Israel was intertwined with the security of Palestine, the security of Palestinians, and the continued progress in Palestinian. And yeah, maybe I'm being, really optimistic here, but I do believe ultimately, when you look at some of that mutual respect, that the issues of the Gulf and the Middle East, we may reach a new uneasy norm or normality, but ultimately at the core of this, we do need to seize this opportunity. Sometimes you need to get into a kind of intense situation as we are now. And I hope, and maybe the US is recognizing this, that no door should be shut, that now is the time yet you move forward to a progressive solution, which ultimately respects the rights, security, and prosperity and progress of all communities, including Israelis and Palestinians. And I think now's the time to seize the moment. So rather than having a sort of uneasy new truth, yes, we need to get the issue and the conflict with resolve the immediate things on the Strait of Hormuz, a deal done on the issue of nuclear disarm, but we also need to look further afield and say, how can we ensure that the kind of things we see here on our own streets, the kind of intensity of protests, and I think that's something we need to continue to protect, as long as it's done within the parameters of the law, that we respond to that. And I think the UK, both from a historic perspective when it comes to Israel-Palestine, but also in terms of what it can do diplomatically, and one hopes through, in time, economically, can actually support something which can see that. I can see a kind of state emerging, but I often, when I'm talking to Israelis and Palestinians, the word is often used, true, independent, sovereign. I said, one thing that diplomacy has taught me, there's always an interdependency. For Israel to prosper fully, protect its citizens and security of its citizens, to allow the next gens and the generation after them to fully prosper, will only be achieved when you have that same vision and outcome desired for people who are literally next door, and tied together through history, and tied together through food and culture. And there's many within civil society who share that role, indeed many politically. You have people like former Prime Minister Ahmad, who has a vision. He was a Prime Minister once upon a time, but has a vision which he signed with former Foreign Minister of the Palestinian Authority, Nasser al-Kidwa, which really has that vision being turned into a reality. So how can we take the current situation in Gaza, the outcome of the, one hopes, a phased withdrawal of Israel, but equally the total and utter disarmament of Hamas, leading to, one hopes, some kind of autonomous rule and governance structure within Gaza, but at the same time not forgetting, what we're seeing in the West Bank, even this morning, the continued occupation and acceleration of the illegal settlers, acting in some cases with the support of the Israeli Defense Forces in impeding onto territories which are clearly Palestinian. There needs to be a solution found, but with that solution, you need to have the vision and the people with the political mind to make it happen. Comes back to what I said earlier as well. You cannot use leverage. We may disagree profoundly, and we do with a lot of the, we've got extremists like Ben Gvir and Mr. Smotrich in Israel, who have rightly been sanctioned. But they should not be the ones who prevail. There are progressives in Israel who understand, who have the vision to be able to build that kind of peace and security, not just for, as I said, Israelis, but for Palestinians. And this has a knock-on effect. Now, some would say you've got to dissociate it, but at least it takes away also an important element of the excuses sometimes we hear, even with the Iranians, that somehow their actions are in defense of what's happening to the Palestinian people and the suppression of this, what's happening in Lebanon. There are ways and solutions to be found, but let's use this opportunity, this extremity of conflict we've seen in the Gulf, that the world is seized of, and we've felt the impact of consistently. But let's seize the moment and pull back from this extremity. But we must get to the core of the solution as well when it comes to Israel-Palestine.
I mean, when you say we can't use leverage, what do you mean? Because did you find yourself ever using leverage diplomatically?
Yeah, it was personal. It was picking up a phone and saying who has access. I remember once trying to get aid into Gaza. I had a good relationship with the then Israeli foreign minister who had Moroccan heritage. Long story short, good relationship with the Moroccans. We managed to get Ashdod port open with their corporation. We managed to get aid in despite all the barriers. But these were sort of perhaps good news stories which didn't get the coverage, but they were practical human relationships which unlocked a particular situation. The Jordanians played an important role in bridging some of the gaps, and one forgets, that we have relationships. And perhaps if I was to give a very positive sort of outcome, we currently find the Middle East. You've got Israel currently has peace agreements with Jordan. It has a peace agreement with Egypt. Those, notwithstanding what we saw happening in Gaza and Iran, have, under extreme pressure, still stand today. We've seen the Abraham Accords. Now, there's many opponents of the Abraham Accords, but Bahrain, UAE and Morocco took a decision forward. I'm a supporter of them because it is a means to an end. And when you talk to the Abraham Accord countries, whilst the US have a perspective that this will lead to normalization with Israel, good. There's the other side of the coin, which means that Palestine will come into being. And if we are to see those Abraham Accords being fully harnessed by not just the Gulf states, not just the Arab states, but the wider Muslim world, there is a key deliverable, which is the deliverable of a state of Palestine with the right security, progress and prosperity for their citizens. So I think there is scope there because, again, with the Abraham Accords, notwithstanding the challenges we've seen on Bahrain and the UAE, that they've still stood the test of what happened in Gaza, stood the test of what's happened in Iran. So there's scope to progress those. And perhaps we can contextualize when I talk to, key players in the region and I continue to have really strong relationships, is talk to them and say, how can we perhaps take, Lord Ahmed and Nasser al-Qidwa's plan and merge it into what we currently see in terms of the peace agreements that have been reached in Gaza? How can we take it to that next stage? But the crucial thing in all of this, which has been missing since the time of when this conflict began, and it comes back to the UK, from the Balfour Declaration in 1917 to the partition of the Mandate of Palestine in 47 and the subsequent situations and wars that arose. The UK always had a historical legacy role. So we need to reposition ourselves to ensure that the conversations that we're having and the relationships we have with Palestinians and with Israelis is a key component of that. And we still are very much respected across the wider region in the Middle East and in the Gulf. The art of British diplomacy was often a smile and nod, but with degree of silence and quietness. And it's our hallmark of what we do and how we do it. Well, other countries have sort of adapted and adopted, I would argue, the British way of doing things. Well, maybe we need to sort of go back and say, actually, this worked for us in the past, and it worked certainly in my time as a minister. And I think we just need to reignite ourselves in terms of our art of diplomacy as well, because I think we have an important role to play in terms of what we can contribute through diplomacy, what we can contribute through relationships in civil society, in security and defense, but also in terms of economic progress and prosperity. And, as a former banker, I was in banking and finance for 20 years. I fully believe, if people are feeling better about themselves, if they're feeling better about the prospects around them, better about their families, their towns, cities, and indeed their country's progress in terms of prosperity, it really creates an optimistic outlook. But if you don't provide that horizon, you don't provide it with the timelines that are required, then actually we end up being in the kind of malaise we find ourselves in the current situation.
I mean, if only Bernard wanted to speak to you and you had a chat with him, what advice would you give him?
Get involved, get the right people involved, and once they're there, keep them on. Those relationships really, really matter. And then be very honest with yourselves and what is it that we're bringing to the table? What is that Britain can do? We can convene meetings. We can bring people together. We can bridge gaps. We still have good relations across the region. And even with parts of the government and the regime in Iran, there are people that we could engage with, have relationships with. They may be difficult discussions, but they're discussions nevertheless. So I think those are some things we can certainly put on the table. There's a lot when Britain's talked down. I've never been this kind of thing that sees Britain as a middle power. We're not the United States. We're not China.
Are we middle power?
No, I'd say we're something bigger than that. If you've got countries, we're a G7 member, which means we have one of the largest economies. And with the current situation, we've actually now become bigger than India again. I'm sure it will go back the other way with the size of the Indian economy, but we're bigger than them as of the fifth largest. We have my own stomping around the city of London. I would argue one of the most profound major financial capitals. We do the biggest levels of FX trades anywhere in the world, notwithstanding the whole negative arguments against Brexit. We have a resilient structures in terms of our financial services economies. I think we need to invest more in, as has been shown, in issues of food security, but our agricultural and farming industries need support and protection, but they actually provide strong support for us. Our people is our richest resource in terms of, often it's talked about this word diversity. Well, actually, from my family's been here almost 80 years or whatever, very proud of who we are, what we are, but our heritage, history, faiths, communities, different experience add to the strength of a country. We need to leverage that fully. And that hope of horizon you can provide as well. We're a nuclear power. Notwithstanding all the negatives about, are we providing enough in terms of NATO support and defense, which is an argument which I'm sure will continue. But when you take away all of that, we've still got a strong Navy, we've got strong people, we've got a strong defense industry. We have resilience built in, notwithstanding what's happened in Brexit. I wasn't a Brexiteer. I wanted to remain, but I always remained confident that notwithstanding an exit from the EU, our economy was resilient enough. So some of the challenges we're facing right now on migration, etc., do need direct addressing. But coming back to your central question, I don't think we're a middle power. We're much more than that. But I also accept that we're not China or the United States, and we have a big role to play. And coming back to the sort of essence and core of our conversation, I think our diplomatic clout is important. We have one of the biggest networks of embassies and missions across the world. I always, as a minister, protected that. We had a massive development budget. Yes, I accept our government cut it from 0.7 to 0.5, but we did it in a way which was factored to allow us to continue to have the support for longer term, medium term projects. Again, coming back to that, in bringing people up. It wasn't just about handouts. It was about hand-ups and how you can invest more in those particular areas. And I think we need to refine that. I was a great supporter of development and remain so. Defence, development, diplomacy, key assets of the United Kingdom. And I think they defined us as being more than just a middle power.
Do you feel that Iran's holding out for the midterms to vote Donald Trump?
No, I don't think it's there. I think, I worked with the first Trump administration, and there were times where we had disagreements with them. I remember having conversation when they then left the Human Rights Council, when they pulled out some of the climate accords. We certainly made the case to the then administration, to President Trump and his team, Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State, that they should remain. We didn't succeed, but it didn't. The important thing there was respect. I served and I saw the relationship that both Theresa May and indeed Boris Johnson had with President Trump. And notwithstanding the differences and views we had, again, what was it? It was personal relationships. And I saw there was a great respect both ways. There were profound disagreements at times over certain things. I've alluded to two of them. We'd have different ways of doing things, but we had strong links and communications, and that continued. And I think that needs to be, I think it was right, Prime Minister Burnham sort of reached out to the United States. It's good to hear what President Trump had to say about it. That relationship across the pond is a key one of us. I don't suddenly say, oh, we should discard the US and now start building with the Euro. No, but you can have a measured relationship with the Europeans. I don't think we should go back to the EU, because we'll go back on sort of much more secondary terms than where we were in the first place. But that doesn't preclude the fact that we can have a very constructive engagement. We have good relations with many of our European counterparts. We have good security agreements in place as well. And Europe needs the United Kingdom. But equally, we need to continue to invest strongly in our US relationships. And you talked about advice to Andy Burnham. When we have differences, and maybe perhaps this applies more to our cousins and friends across the pond, but even on our side, we don't need to certainly play out disagreements publicly all the time. Diplomacy at its best, and disagreements are best resolved behind closed doors. And actually, you get a much better solution at the end of the day as well.
And what are the elephant traps he might walk into?
Well, I think there's always public perception, public pressure. I think you need to have a clear plan. He has 2.5 years before the next election. Keep people in place. Don't suddenly become personality driven. Get the right people in the right place with the right merits, the right... if I was sitting in his position, as maybe someone who came across the private sector, I always found it a bit strange. In the private sector, people progress, generally speaking, because you had the right qualifications, the right experiences, the abilities, the competencies put together to be able to do the job. That doesn't always work in the terms of politics. So I think...
Why?
I think because there's things done, there's sort of agreements reached, people to satisfy, constituencies to meet, to maintain a sense of government. I mean, I found during my time in government, when we had the coalition government, and all credit to David Cameron, he kept people on. He would also call people into the room.
He kept people on
longer term in positions,
right.
Certainly at the senior positions. You look at his time during that first power, William Hague, Foreign Secretary, Theresa May, Home Secretary, George Osborne, Chancellor of the Exchequer. Those were positions which gave economy was covered, foreign policy and diplomacy was covered, home affairs and security was covered, because he had people in position, and our international partners saw the continuity and stability. So coming back to Andy Burnham is don't give in just for the sake of change to change of individuals, but also be clear in his direction. I think this kind of conversation with the British public sounds good, but what will it actually mean? I remember when we were talking about the defence investment plan, saying to some of my friends in the Labour Party, in the Labour government, I said, it's good you're talking, but go out there with an objective. Yes, you've got to sell the importance of defence. If suddenly Mr. Putin gets more aggressive and decides to unleash something, we need to be able to defend our borders, our skies. Investment in health and education is important, but it's no good if you're standing there in the rubble of a hospital or a school. I don't think we're at that point now, but nevertheless, we've got to be, so that first issue of security, you've got to sell that, but sell it with a purpose and ensure that people understand, have a time to scrutinize, but also you're there to lead. You can't lead by committee, you can't lead by public opinion. Sometimes you've got to go with principles. When you see about how Margaret Thatcher is talked about now,
in terms of
her legacy, both within the party and also more economically. When you see the rise of reform, many people, oh yeah, we need to see Margaret Thatcher. When Margaret Thatcher was doing what she was doing in her day, it wasn't she did it with this great fanfare of support, but she had a vision of kind of in terms of a monetary policy, her, economic principles that we should, a bit like the Reagan years. Ronald Reagan is now perceived, and I've always regarded him very highly in terms of the legacy he left. And I quote him, right, profound in terms of a great believer in humor and politics he would inject at the right time. But actually he had a vision of what he wanted to create in terms of economic prosperity. And I think he sort of fulfilled that. I think Margaret Thatcher did. And when people talk, rightly so, about the things she achieved, from privatization to some of the agendas to council ownership, I think that's again had a prosperity agenda. It was ironic, of course, that it was our own party that decided that we no longer wanted Margaret Thatcher. But I think so. Don't be taken in by the short term. Look at what your medium, long-term objectives are. The other thing is, though, and I feel this very strongly, create an economy which attracts inward investors. Having this thing that somehow wealth is an evil. No, actually, we want to have wealth creators in our country, but you've got to create the situation, the environment that allows people not to leave the UK, but to invest in the UK. And unfortunately, over the last couple of years or so, 2.5 years almost now of the Labour government, that's what we've seen. We've not just seen billionaires leaving, not just millionaires leaving, but people who are high income earners no longer see the UK as conducive in terms of their own long-term prospects, in terms of education of their kids. I think it was appalling that VAT was put on education for the first time on independent schools. It's not achieved the result that they set out. It was a good sort of public, we can't have private, whatever it was, 94% of children are educated in state schools. But you don't bring someone up by bringing another side down. You try and raise the standard. That was in education. The issues on inheritance tax here. Again, don't be taken in, let's tax them. People will leave. Then where are your wealth creators? We're not we're not a state-run, we're not China. We're not a socialist, communist country. We need the private sector. We need wealth creators, and you need to create the conditions to allow wealth creators to remain. So yes, look at inheritance tax. Why should people who worked hard, etc., who are giving and leaving a legacy for their families, have to suffer not once, but twice, but maybe even 3 times, a taxation level, which is basically going to ask them, actually, if you want to belong, you have to take this. No, that's not the way forward. So look at that and don't be taken in by short-termism.
If you have a vision and you have the drive and you want to move quickly, actually, how quickly could you move in our system? Is it the case where you put things in place and they pop up and are effective 10 years later? How quickly can you move?
I accept that, but we're a democracy, and obviously we have a elected House of Commons. And when we look at legislation which is brought into the House of Lords, first and foremost, we always look at with a view that what has the elected chamber decided upon this? Was it a manifesto commitment? And those manifestos are there for a reason, because that criteria is used by how we will deal with that legislation. But coming back to your specific question, why I say that is that both the government of Boris Johnson and indeed the government of Keir Starmer had massive mandates. It's how you use and leverage those majorities to be able to take forward the kind of outcomes you want to see. And you must do it through communication, using your networks, those members of parliament. So, as I said earlier on the defence investment plan, it's the right thing to do to be able to say, we're going to sell the importance of defence and security to the people of the UK. How can you leverage what you have? Keir Starmer did, and Andy Burnham has, the numbers to be able to take through his key priorities. But you can't keep doing like the necessity of some of the welfare reforms that were needed and suddenly pulling back from the brink, because sometimes you've got to drive through those hard choices and make those coalitions. In this case, it would have been coalitions with parties such as the Conservative Party to get through those reforms, because you do have that vision, you do have that objective, that long term, that's what's required, because something's got to give from somewhere to be able to achieve an outcome. So if you set yourself a goal or target, sometimes you've got to take that, not for political expediency, but for the medium long term. And yes, some of these things won't be easy wins. Even in the private sector, when we set a strategy for a company, we set a more medium term strategy of at least 3 to 5 years to see those outcomes. And every pound invested won't suddenly return the kind of return within a day, a week, or even a year. So you've got to have that vision. You've got to then communicate to your shareholders, to your own staff, of what that achievement is. And that's where the focus should be. So set out that agenda. And I hope, I come back to my earlier point, without having this kind of demonizing of wealth creators and those who have given so much to the country that they're now thinking of what's keeping me here, and create the conditions to allow for that kind of inward investment. During the time of my government, after Brexit, and often it's talked about in a negative sense, but there were deals done. The deal we did with a number of Asian countries, the CPTPP, for example, which allowed access to new economies. We did FTA agreements with Australia. More recently, I know the government's taken a lot of credit, but who started the negotiations on the Indian FTA, the GCC FTA? Well, let's leverage it, open up the full potential of it, and make sure that our economy, our country, can benefit to it. Now, I'm an inward investor looking to the UK. I want to see what kind of rate and return I get. But if I invest here, I also want to know, is the environments there? Have we created enterprise zones which allow for a more sort of welcoming tax base for a company looking to invest in the UK? What is the employment and training in the local area? What is the kind of sense of wealth opportunities, creations? At the moment, there's a lot of emphasis on AI, rightly so. There's a lot of emphasis on technology. We saw during the Ukraine conflict the increasing focus on drone manufacturing. It's great. But to leverage that and to attract investors, you've also got to create the environment and conditions. And at the moment, if your high earners no longer see as UK as their place to be, well, then I think something's going desperately wrong.
You mentioned a middle power, just to go back to that. Is it a self-perception issue? Do we perceive ourselves as that, or is it how we're seen on the international
Well,
stage?
perhaps I can counter by asking you a question. If you keep calling yourself something, whatever it may be, and being magnanimous is great, but if you say it long enough and consistently enough, others will say, well, if he thinks that about himself, well,
Why are we saying this?
I really don't know. I think it's this kind of recognition that's happened that we're not China and US, and I've said that already, we're not. But at the same time, I've listed just a few. I could be here consistently, from the economy to other areas, listing why the UK is what it is. But in doing so, we have to position ourselves as saying, yes, we're not. Just because, I have a lot of respect for Mark Carney and what he said, and everyone heralding this thing about middle power. I don't allude to that. Yes, it may be applicable and right for Canada, and he's done exactly the right thing. He's shown leadership and etc. But, one thing we have, you look at a country like Pakistan, it's leveraged its position also, because in the back of people's mind, it's one of the stated nuclear powers of the world. Well, hold on a moment, so are we. We don't need to necessarily spell it out, but we have that defense capability and capacity. So that is another element and strength we bring. But if you say something about yourself, which is almost demeaning yourself, then it won't be too long before others will say, well, if that's what they think, let them think that way. And others will then see you in that light. We shouldn't do that. I'm not saying boast, so we're saying we're some great major power of the equivalents of the United States and China. We're not. But at the same time, I'd probably put ourselves on par with countries such as France, maybe Germany too, but not, even with Germany, they don't have their own independent nuclear deterrent. So we're slightly above that. But don't talk and put yourselves down. Talk yourself about ambition. Talk about yourselves as a nation, about ambition and achievement. And I put it on self. If I have my own family unit, and I keep talking, oh, well, things aren't this. You want to instill in your future generations a sense of positivity. You want to say, this is possible, the art of the possible. If you've got these basic components ready, you have an education, you have a sound home, you have good, opportunities, a good group of friends. Actually, you're not worrying about everything and every single bill coming in. Actually, life's not too bad. Actually, you can progress to the next level. Even those who economically are struggling can sometimes just take a step back. I come back to what I said, my late father, just look around you and you'll see that. But the UK's positioning right now is crucial. So don't talk yourselves down. Talk about the UK being who we are. Boris Johnson during his time, and I think it was the right, again, vision that he wanted to create in London, in the UK, the Europe equivalent of Silicon Valley. I think that's great ambition. During his time, again, it's not talked about, but you look at how our energy mix changed. We became one of the leading energy providers in terms of offshore wind. The investments that we made in that idea, again, it was about self-reliance. And I think we get into that sphere where you've got to think more longer term. He never gets the benefit of that, but actually we did achieve a lot more. There were towns and villages around the country which were being totally, run off these new wind turbines. Not everyone's cup of tea, but the fact was it was meeting a need domestically by domestic provision. We were right to ream ourselves off the issue of Russian gas. That's why we didn't suffer whereas countries like Germany were investing in Nord Stream 2, despite our warnings that don't rely on this. This thing can be turned off as quickly as it's turned on. Ukraine suffered that. So I think we have that resilience. We have, but it needs leadership, it needs vision, and the ability to say, within these timelines, that is what I seek to deliver. And we are democracy. And then you stand by those promises as well.
But what happens to these projects? Like, if you have this vision and a new government comes in, do you sort of leave this skeletal shell on a hill somewhere? How does it work?
No, it doesn't. I think it's right that some of the national conversations, which Andy Burnham's alluded to, are held. I've always felt you can almost take out the kind of political wrangling across key areas such as defence, such as health, such as education, and actually agree. And we have, notwithstanding what people often see, there's some great relationships across different political parties, and actually agree that this is a kind of national plan in key sectors, which, irrespective of a few nuances here and there, is the core of what we aim to deliver for the British people over the next, say, horizon of 10 years, and get political parties to commit to that. Yes, you can't tie one particular parliament to the next, but at least you can look at it for a 5-year plan, bring people in, reach out to people across political divides and see what can bring in. I remember when the Conservative Party was coming back in and we formed the coalition at that time with David Cameron. He had set up all kinds of policy groupings to look at different things, but to broaden the appeal of the party, to make the party more electable. A lot of people said we wouldn't be able to come back from that, but we did. But interestingly enough, there was also, about reaching across, a deal was done with the Liberal Democrats. They were probably had a very differing agenda to what we had, even more so than the Labour Party under Gordon Brown at that time. But there was a kind of compromise reached over certain issues, and we saw some decisions, sometimes quite difficult ones, being taken. But there was a kind of broadening of the base. And I think that does need to happen. But on coming back on some of these key issues, I think you can make calls on saying that this is a 10-year vision tied by the 5-year parliamentary term that we have on areas such as health and education, and indeed defence. And I think it's the right way forward.
Yeah, Prime Ministers get an awful bashing. That's part of the job. But the Prime Ministers you've
so do ministers, I would add.
And ministers. But what are the individual strengths that people don't often see that you've seen in various Prime Ministers or people you've worked with at that level?
One is the ability to listen more than anything else. Get the right people in the room.
Who are we talking about?
David Cameron was very good at this. I remember when we were dealing with some of the issues on countering extremism, we'd had the London attacks just before. That was after we'd lost the elections, but building from that, and we're going back now to early 2005, 2006 time, where we started looking at these things about how you could bring people together. And he did that both in opposition and did that in government, where he would listen, he would get the right people around the table, hear what they had to say. It wasn't necessarily for him to then agree with them, but he'd given them an hearing and an opportunity. And I saw that consistently. He created cabinet committees to cabinet. So it wasn't just cabinet. He would then take key leads from cabinet and look at, right, you're now going to lead on cyber. Let's get the right people from different departments in on the cyber one, and so on and so forth. So I think that ability to listen, but then also to, in terms of the governance structures, was very good. Have a determination of what you want to achieve during it. And then I think he showed, when he resigned after the Brexit, there were others perhaps who would have stood by it, that he put so much into the Remain campaign that he felt it was no longer sustainable. I think that faith in standing by your decisions and then taking, the cost when those decisions don't go with you. So I certainly saw that. I think also demonstrate that you're human, the human side of it. I'm very close to Theresa May. I've known her since I was 18. She has a great sense of humour. People won't necessarily say that was but with hindsight, I often wonder, had we switched and had Boris Johnson before and Theresa May then afterwards, would it have changed the notion of where we'd got to? But that's...
And what's even making?
I think the Brexit issue was so, and that remains with us now, that was going to remain almost something that would, at times it could get quite toxic over the battles that were raging, that you needed perhaps someone who would have been more on one side than the other, but not so wedded in not being able to bring other people together. And coming back to these qualities of prime ministers is also the ability to bring and listen. I mean, it's often not talked about. I served under Theresa. I think she was very principled. She would hold her own. So I think that's an important attribute. Boris Johnson,
holding her own, what would you mean?
In particular, in sort of more tough sort of negotiations, notwithstanding she had to deal with I think the election call in 2017 was the wrong call, too early, too soon. Need to choose your advisor as well. Here's the other advice. I think Boris suffered and challenged from that with the whole Dominic Cummings issue. But again, an endearing quality of Boris. I was his, when he was Foreign Secretary, I was a minister in the Lords doing a wide variety of things on foreign affairs. But he made it almost every month we would meet, just me and him, for breakfast to talk about everything and anything. And that showed a sense of people skills. I think that's essential. How can you bring in the quality of someone, engage with someone you may not talk, but create the conditions where that issue of respect is created on a two-way basis. So I think these things, I'm talking of different leaders with different qualities, but I think that was very important. I think where people then failed as well, I think Liz Truss failed because she may have had a good agenda when it came to the issues of the economy, but she didn't roll the pitch. Her and Kwasi failed to engage. You don't go and fire top civil servants as they did with Tom Scholar at the Treasury on literally hours on taking office. That's not the way you do. I think a mistake we also made in the Boris Johnson years when we merged the FCO and DFID was someone who was, and I know him extremely well, I have great respect for him, is Simon MacDonald, now Lord Macdonald. He was the permanent secretary at the Foreign Office. They kept him on for 6 months, 10 months, because he knew the institutions, the system, rather than just rush to change. Look at people, their experience. Yes, you have a vision, unpack it, bring people on board, and you'll see a better outcome. I think that could have been managed better. Coming back to Liz Truss, has she rolled the pitch? Has she got in people from business, from the city?
What do you mean by roll the pitch, as in laid it out properly?
No, consult people. This is what I'm planning to do. Get them in, see the business leaders, call the optics matter, let the city know. There was a lot of speculation happening, which was causing runs on the market. Well, a sure way to address it is get those people in who are your key advocates and let them become advocates for yourself. If suddenly you had the advocacy of leaders from the City of London and elsewhere in business saying, actually, the plans which have been as they've been laid out and planned for us, actually there's a sense we feel there's some reservations on these elements of it. But when you don't reveal and you then try and force things through, I think that's a mistake. And you certainly shouldn't go around, firing people as a means of defense. We saw that recently with Keir Starmer. When you suddenly start using whatever the situation, and this, it was obviously a judgment call and the appointments and this, that, and the other, but putting all that aside, suddenly then trying to put the blame on it was X's fault or Y, and often officials, is not the way to do it. You need to have the determination, see that objective, and get those officials to do so. There were many a times, I can assure you, I had many, yes, minister moments in my time in office. So I'm looking at that. But
in what way? Which one?
Options being presented which wouldn't meet my agreement, or then perhaps suggesting things like, oh, number 10 has said this. Well, number 10 is quite a big machinery. And I fast came to a conclusion there would be two people who could overrule me, and they could call me directly. One was the Prime Minister and the other was the Foreign Secretary. And if I'd taken a particular call, which to me wasn't earth-shattering, etc., in terms of an option which was costed, sensible to move forward on, then I would push it through unless I got a call to the contrary. And there was only one occasion where that happened, and indeed it was on a clarification. I won't name the Prime Minister that was, about what I was doing, and the Prime Minister was in total agreement with what I was proposing. So I think don't be, to ministers, you asked about Andy Burnham, to new ministers taking up their roles, get under your brief, get to understand your brief, put your head down, don't worry about media headlines, etc. Get on with the job and master your brief and give it all. But invest in relationships, get to know your civil servants, identify experts in the ranks of your own teams so they can help work with you, set out plans, be over the detail, make sure that if there's policy objectives set for your particular brief, that they're being delivered upon. And maybe it's because I worked in the private sector for a long time that I was able to then deploy those skills. But if we don't have it, when you become
Skills,
minister,
relationship skills,
all of it, when you become a minister, you don't have, it's not, let's get your feet under the table over the next sort of couple of weeks, 6 months. No, day one, you're dealing with a crisis, a situation, an issue. And if you're not equipped, you have to learn very, very quickly. And I think that's why I come back to a point I made earlier, is pick the right people, pick people with experience and insight, because that will be for the benefit, not just of his government, but for our country as well.
Move on to Saudi Arabia and the Gulf. They're transforming at a remarkable speed. How significant could they become in the global economy over the next decade?
Well, I think Saudi Arabia is interesting. You've seen with the Crown Prince, if you go back to 2017, I remember visiting Saudi Arabia officially as a minister, and it was very conservative. It was very, the stories you heard about were very clear. Then I visited again in 2019, and it was the day or two after where some of the new announcements had been made. And there was great excitement on mixed restaurants, music's being played in restaurants, this, that, which you and I would take as quite a norm, but it was a departure from what was there. But from that onwards to now, 22, 23, the opening up of Saudi Arabia, notwithstanding, we're not, to suddenly say, oh, tomorrow this will be a multi-party liberal democracy. That's not Russia, but there are certain reforms which are happening. We saw reforms on areas of human rights. We saw women emerging in major leadership roles. You saw the issue of extremism. Saudi Arabia had quite a regimental way of allowing, for example, different Muslim communities to visit. But, he, to his credit, Mohammed bin Salman said, it's not for him to judge who is a good Muslim, bad Muslim, what community they, but if someone says they have an entitlement to visit the holies. So he's tried to do away with a lot of the bureaucracy, the walls. He's tried to open up. We've seen it with some of the sports events that are happening, the concerts recently, the boxing that took place. I think these are good things. But at the same time, the issue of representation of people is incumbent within Islamic structures as well. So, people talk about the UN Charter. One of the early things within Islam at a time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was this Medina Charter, which was actually, when you unpack it, saw the rights of citizens rights of minorities being protected. So there are, how can I put it, sort of plans which were there historically for an emerging nation with a historic legacy that continues to have as a custodian of holy sites, leader or within the Islamic world, to sort of look back at some of the fundamentals to see, on issues of women's rights as well. I often say the first person to accept Islam was Prophet Muhammad's wife, Hazrat Khadija. She was the businesswoman. He was working for her. Now, she wasn't doing it in some back room, not being consulted. So women's empowerment was not a new issue. It was very much within the context of Islam, and different faiths brought that together. The issue and the way Islam, where would be without algebra and algorithms if those early scholars had not taken forward what they had. So coming back to Saudi Arabia, I think he's beginning to incorporate some of these reforms and changes. And the issue of representation of people through shura councils, as they have elected individuals working within the sort of context of their constitutional arrangements, I think is the way forward. And I think we're seeing reforms in that agenda. Economy-wise, they've been hit hard more recently because of the conflicts that are taking place. But I think there's a real vision, and this vision of 2030 and beyond, I think is real. There'll be component parts of it which will be deliverable, others perhaps which were ambitious beyond that particular timeline. But I think certainly from my own personal experience from 2017 to the current day, you've seen an opening up within Paran, but without losing the essence of what Saudi Arabia also is from its religious legacy, which is also crucial.
So which other countries do you see as being the biggest winners over the next 10 years?
I think there's some important, one thing is I think world affairs are going to play an important role, and you continue to see countries like China will play an important role on global economies, the way they're, you can look at foreign exchange holdings, you can see reserve holdings, you can see supply chain influences, and I think China will remain an important player. And for that reason alone, who continue to be successful. I think those countries that harness AI and invest in technology, in the whole idea of data and the digital economy, will also benefit. I think those who will adapt to the changing workforces will also benefit. So you can see those early inklings in certain countries, which are grasping this within, the US, yes, will always remain there. And I think it'll be a long time before that emerges differently. But I think you'll see countries emerging, one in the Middle East, with a key caveat to add around this issue of the conflict, who will emerge as key players. You're seeing Qatar opening up to the private investor, to institutional investor. We've talked of Saudi. You've seen what the UAE has done. I think there's great optimism in my mind for countries such as Bahrain and Kuwait, who have the structures there to actually do much more with their economies and open up. And I think that we'll see an emerging, we've seen, if you like, an economic influence shift to the Middle East. We've seen increasingly a diplomacy element shift to the Middle East. We talked about it earlier in terms of the role countries such as Qatar have been playing. But equally now, we see also a military element with these new arrangements. Again, I spoke of it earlier, agreements that are being reached with, in this case, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Pakistan. I think these countries now also recognize that their military standing is also different. So I think we're going to see some real emerging economies becoming much more stronger economies across that part of the world in Asia, beyond just China. We're going to see other countries. Malaysia, I think, has great potential. Indonesia has great potential. But a lot of countries in the Middle East have the economic resource, the diplomatic experience now and insight, and the military alliances that they're seeking to create beyond the traditional alliances they had, to position themselves as real, stronger, sort of emerging countries.
And then what's your sort of future prediction on the UK-India free trade agreement? I mean, who's going to benefit the most, and how do you see that unfolding?
Well, I think every agreement has to benefit both sides. I think it's a great agreement in principle. I think a lot of it is, once it comes into play properly, how that will emerge. I think there needs to be a bit more strategic thinking. I think we had a stuttered start. I'm sure you'll recall, no sooner had we signed the agreement, there was the great steel strategy that the government produced. And I suddenly realized there was a component part of it which was having detrimental effects on imports of steel from India. So we've just got to make sure that we don't have these sort of unintended accidents, which is detrimental to the trade agreement, but which means that it needs a better sell across government understanding. But I think there will be winners for us, one hopes, in the service sectors. I think there are certain industries and sectors that will benefit, such as some of our, one hopes, again, tech alliances that we have. I think manufacturing, India into the UK, I think we'll see more on that side. India has invested heavily on the manufacturing side, more so than the UK in recent years, and I'm sure they're looking at these particular markets. I think equally the exchanges on that we've obviously benefited over many years before the FTA, such as some of the service agreements we have on professionals, I think that will be a mutual benefit. So I can see it balanced, but I think we need to give it a couple of years to see how it's operationalized, and then we'll be able to really assess the attention. But it's got to be sold. What are the benefits of this? What does it
to the public?
Yeah, to the public, but also to industry and sectors as well. Like, there's a lot of negotiations that happen. What does this actually mean? How will these reduction in tariffs actually work? What will it actually mean for me as a producer in India or a service provider in the UK? How will this actually help in terms of mobility? How will it? Because at the moment, I think, notwithstanding the agreement, there's not been much publicity around it. And there was a lot of time invested in it. A lot of people spend a lot of time negotiating and working through. I know I spent whilst I wasn't directly involved because I was on the trade side, there were times where I encountered the odd obstacle, and I was deployed to try and unblock that. And I think there's a lot of time invested into it, but I think this will be mutually beneficial. When you look at the fifth and sixth largest economy interchangeably coming together, it can only spell as one thing, which will be successful both. But I think it needs to be sold better to sectors, industries, and indeed, as you said, to people on both sides.
How do you even come up with something like that? I mean, it seems like a miracle. It's a very, very clever thing created. It appears, but I don't know because I'm not behind the scenes like you are. How do you even conceive of something like that? How do you get it sold to both sides? How do you push it forward? The resistance across the board must be huge.
There is, but the starting principle has to be that you're doing it as a partnership. This isn't one side coming in as a sort of bigger player than the other. There's also an acceptance that there's not just take, there's give. There are concessions to be made. So, I mean, it was often touted, this whole issue of whiskey, which came to the fore. But, from having whiskey manufacturers here in the UK exporting to India would have been unheard of, particularly where India has particularly for not its most sort of socially and economically mobile communities, but those who are less so. There's a real manufacturing element in that particular area of whiskey, yet we were able to sort of sit down and get the kind of tariff reductions that were needed to make it a economically viable export. And that was hard graft. I mean, I'm simplifying it by the number, and that's just one example that I can give. I think, but also looking at how cooperation can work. So again, going back during the times we were having some of these discussions on issues of, for example, climate and the economy, how could you bring about sustainable energy resourcing? Like India is investing as a great leader on solar. I alluded earlier that we have great capacity in terms of offshore wind. How can you bring those kind of technologies to bear and work for the interests of both India and the UK? Are there agreements that can be reached in a bilateral way through this agreement, which can also act as a mutually beneficial export to a third country? So I think there are areas to be worked on which will allow this to happen. But as I said, on the very starting point is it has to be something that they want and we want, whichever country, region you're dealing with. But secondly is also having in your mind as negotiators that it's about give and take. And just because you may be perceived as a larger economy, or you are, doesn't necessarily mean that you will get everything you want at the end of the day. I certainly would not adopt the kind of methodology that President Trump adopted in trying to do sort of broad tariffs or carpet tariffs and holding out in a very transactional way. These are about careful negotiations to ensure there is a mutual benefit.
If you were advising businesses today, where would you tell them to focus their time most?
I think, in terms of if it was UK businesses looking at emerging markets, I have already said, notwithstanding the war, I think there's great prospects in the Middle East. With countries opening up now, there's a real desire, whether you're high net worth individuals looking to set up family offices. I think, places like Switzerland may be challenged by countries in the Gulf, not just UAE, but other countries such as Qatar, Bahrain but they've got to get their own offers done. You've got low levels of taxation, make sure any tax increment that's being introduced is done recognizing where companies might want to invest. So certainly I think the Middle East, notwithstanding what has happened, I think investor confidence has been shaken because of the vulnerabilities we've seen with the recent conflict. But I think that's a huge potential because it's a real sort of at the heart of it in terms of the physical presence, in terms of a gateway to Africa, gateway into Central Asia. I think there are certain Central Asian economies such as Azerbaijan who are emerging, a good economy, has some real opportunities there. I've alluded to Malaysia and Indonesia. I think they provide real potential. And it's driven partly by the fact that the people and populations of these countries are there and there's an emerging middle class. And of course, India, we can't preclude the fact that the reason we went in so strongly on the FTA with India is because we see it. You've got a massive emerging middle class. It's the most, it's the biggest people country anywhere in the world now, outdoes China. emphasis on education, etc. And how can some of these partnerships work? So I think is identifying right partners in the grounds in countries such as India who know those local markets as well. So it's not about going on your own, it's by identifying local expertise. But I think certainly from the Middle East all the way through to countries such as Indonesia, I think there's real opportunities.
And finally, what are you seeing today that most people won't fully understand for the next for about 5 years' time?
I think one of the things, more than anything else, I think we live in a world which is technology dominated, from the social media world we now live in. And I think we look towards our next gen. And it was interesting. I'll give you two responses, if I may. First of all, the emergence of areas such as crypto, which we're not touched on. But when you look at certain assessments being made, who uses crypto, we've got about, I think, 10 to 12% take up here. And then you think as a whole population, then you see who does that more. And suddenly the higher usage is amongst those between 18 and 40 or 44. So you think, okay, there's a changing dynamic here. The question is not why, it's actually understanding technology. So I think for a population that we have, people don't quite get how technology is impacting ourselves. I think AI is going to be a huge question. Everyone talks about it, everyone's involved with it, but you go to an average citizen or even a well-educated, well-honed, informed citizen to say, how can the reality of people be replaced with a virtual reality that was perceived to a reality is now? How will AI transform jobs, services? How will it transform daily lives? And I think that understanding, particularly for the more aging, I've alluded to the younger population, to the aging side, needs an education and not to lose the human touch. And then more broadly, I think, is on conflicts. Why do they happen? Why can't we just sort it? Why do we now? I think there's a validity behind that as well. That geopolitics can sometimes drive some of the most, avoidable conflicts. And, there is that kind of vision we all have. There is always enough resources, food, water, etc., to feed the world. But as the geopolitics gets in the way, massive oversimplification. But there is a golden thread of reality through that, albeit a very small thread at times, that you can actually stop human conflict in a way where there is a will and desire to do so. And I think countries like ourselves will have a role to play in that. But I think people don't understand why it can't happen tomorrow.
Lord Ahmed, thank you so much for your time.
Real pleasure.
Thank you.